I'm not suggesting Queen Camilla lacks authority, but that tiara isn't hers. It rightfully belongs to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, for the Christmas gala at Buckingham,
There was no balcony announcement, no televised address, and no dramatic procession through palace gates. Yet behind closed doors, one signature carried more force than any public spectacle. Princess Anne had reached the point where hesitation was no longer acceptable. A silent decree was pushed through. Camilla's final formal royal role was removed, and within minutes, the atmosphere inside the household changed from strained uncertainty to stunned silence. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not expect the envelope to carry an ending. She received it in a private sitting room, believing it concerned a schedule adjustment. But the calm disappeared when she reached the sentence confirming that her final official palace role had been terminated. The confidential royal decree, a formal internal order used to change responsibilities within the household, transferred those duties away from her with immediate effect. That mattered, because other ceremonial responsibilities had already moved toward Anne, William, and Catherine, leaving this position as her last independent foothold inside the working structure. Anne did not celebrate. She remained beside the writing desk after the paperwork had been processed, aware that the decision would be read as something colder than administration. For months, she had watched competing instructions create friction around ceremonies, staff, and authority. Now she had forced through the one measure that removed the ambiguity entirely. The language was unmistakable. The change was permanent, not ceremonial, not temporary, and not something that could be quietly restored later, and nothing could restore it. Camilla read that final wording twice. She lowered the pages to her lap, removed her glasses, and said nothing while an aide waited near the closed door. The silence carried humiliation, disbelief, and something deeper. She understood that this was not merely a reduced workload, it was a judgment on whether she could continue holding authority in her own right. Charles already knew. He had been shown the file before his wife received it, and his reaction had unsettled those expecting an immediate intervention. The king read the decree, set it down, and did not order Anne's decision reversed. His restraint mattered, because a single objection from him could have thrown the entire process back into uncertainty. Instead, he allowed the new arrangement to stand. That was the moment the balance changed. Yet the decree itself was only the visible strike. To understand why Anne was prepared to make such a ruthless move, the story has to shift from the decree itself to the three people whose loyalties, pride, and private history had made this confrontation unavoidable. The decree may have been written in formal language, but nothing about its consequences was impersonal. For Anne, it was a question of duty. For Camilla, it felt like humiliation. For Charles, it reopened a conflict he had spent years trying to prevent. Behind their titles stood three people with very different ideas of loyalty, authority, and what the monarchy owed to those who had sacrificed for it. Anne had always believed that duty became meaningless the moment personal comfort was allowed to weaken it. She had watched responsibilities shift, instructions overlap, and small disagreements become harder to contain. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, saw continuity as something that had to be protected even when family relationships suffered. Yet there was no satisfaction in what she had done. She knew Camilla would not read the decree as an administrative correction. She would read it as rejection. Camilla felt exactly that. Her final role had mattered because it was one of the few remaining positions that belonged to her independently rather than through Charles. Losing it meant more than losing appearances or ceremonial duties. It suggested that years of service had ended without the trust or dignity she believed she had earned. She could accept reduced responsibility. What she struggled to accept was the feeling that the palace had decided she no longer deserved authority of her own. Charles carried the conflict differently. He had already pushed back once, when an earlier proposal suggested reducing the same role, arguing privately that another public diminishment would create unnecessary pain. That resistance had delayed the reckoning, not ended it. Now the king found himself trapped between protecting his wife and accepting Anne's warning that too much accommodation had created confusion inside the household. He knew both women believed they were defending something important, and that made compromise harder, not easier. William had seen the pressure building too. The prince quietly urged restraint, because he understood what a permanent removal could do to family relationships already under strain. He did not challenge Anne's concern about divided authority, but he feared that forcing the issue too sharply would leave Charles wounded and Camilla isolated. His caution revealed how serious the dispute had become. Even those who understood Anne's position were afraid of what victory might cost. Charles finally entered the private room where his sister was waiting alone. He closed the door behind him and asked whether there was still room for compromise. Anne held his gaze for several seconds before answering that compromise had already been tried. Nothing in her voice sounded triumphant. The king left visibly burdened, knowing he had just heard the argument he had spent months avoiding. And the reason Anne believed compromise had failed could be traced to one ceremony where a single confrontation crossed a line she was never prepared to ignore. Every royal crisis has a moment that seems small until history turns back and recognizes it as the fracture point. For Anne, that moment came during a private memorial planning session at Windsor. What began as a disagreement over ceremonial order became something far more serious. One interruption, one refusal, and one decision, made in front of senior household staff, transformed months of tension into a conflict that could no longer be managed quietly. Anne entered that meeting with a clear responsibility. She had been given oversight of the memorial's traditional protocol, meaning the formal order of procession, ceremonial duties, and who would perform each role during the event. William and Catherine were there alongside Camilla and senior household officials, because the final arrangements affected several branches of the family. What mattered was simple. One person had to coordinate the order, or the ceremony risked becoming a public display of private disagreement. Camilla changed the atmosphere with a single objection. She insisted that her office would retain a ceremonial function Anne had already reassigned, and the room tightened immediately. The Princess Royal stayed composed and explained that the change had been made to avoid overlapping instructions. But when the Queen Consort repeated her position after being challenged, Anne no longer saw confusion. She saw an open test of authority. Anne closed the ceremonial folder. She placed both hands flat on the table and told Camilla that two competing chains of command could not exist in the same household. The words were controlled, but everyone understood their weight. Camilla held her expression together, answered that her position still carried responsibilities of its own, and refused to withdraw the instruction. Catherine said almost nothing during the confrontation. Later, in a private conversation with William, she admitted that what had happened no longer felt like a disagreement over one memorial. The princess believed the conflict had become a question of who could give final direction inside the household. William listened carefully, because he had already feared that exactly this kind of moment would force the family toward a permanent choice. The written note circulated after the meeting made everything harder to ignore. It recorded both sets of instructions and showed that senior staff had been left with conflicting directions. Anne kept that documented account because it proved her concern was no longer personal irritation. The dispute had reached the level where divided authority was affecting the palace machinery itself. Camilla left the room furious but outwardly controlled. Anne remained behind after the others had gone, staring at the unsigned schedule and understanding that the argument had crossed a line. Weeks later, When the two women finally faced each other without a room full of courtiers between them, neither was willing to pretend the disagreement was still procedural. The confrontation everyone around them had feared did not happen before cameras or at a formal reception. It happened in private, with no audience to soften the words and no ceremony to hide behind. Anne entered determined to offer one final boundary. Camilla entered believing she was defending the dignity of her position. Within minutes, the disagreement became personal, and the future of her last royal role was hanging by a thread. Anne had requested the meeting herself and made one condition clear: no aides, no private secretaries, no intermediaries. She wanted every word heard directly. The private secretariat, the small senior office that manages a royal's official work and correspondence, had already carried too many competing messages between the two women. This time, there would be nowhere for either side to hide behind interpretation. Camilla arrived convinced there was still room to compromise. She was prepared to accept fewer practical duties if the formal role itself remained hers. But Anne cut through that hope almost immediately. The Princess Royal told her the issue was no longer workload, it was trust. Too many instructions had collided. Too many staff members had been forced to choose between competing directions. And the Windsor confrontation had made the problem impossible to dismiss. Camilla reacted sharply. She pushed back against the suggestion that she had become a liability, and accused Anne of seeing her as an outsider who could never fully belong, no matter how many years she served beside Charles. The Queen Consort's anger carried something deeper than pride. She believed the fight had stopped being about one role and become a judgment on whether she would ever be accepted on equal emotional ground within the family. Anne did not retreat. She revealed that she had already asked advisors to identify the constitutional and household mechanisms required to end the position completely. In plain terms, those mechanisms were the formal steps needed to remove the role without leaving its duties confused or open to challenge. Camilla went still. Only then did she understand that this was not really a negotiation. It was her final chance to step aside voluntarily. Camilla pushed her chair back and asked whether Anne had already decided her fate. Anne stayed where she was and answered that she was being given the chance to decide how the ending happened. The words landed harder than any raised voice could have. Camilla refused. She would not surrender the role willingly, and she would not give Anne the satisfaction of calling the departure voluntary. Anne left with the answer she needed. Her voice had remained controlled throughout, but once outside the room she gripped the edge of a console table for a brief moment before moving on. The next stage would not be driven by emotion at all. It would depend on who possessed enough authority to transform Anne's determination into an order nobody inside the palace could quietly undo. Royal power rarely moves with the drama imagined from outside palace walls. It moves through wording, precedent, signatures, access, and the willingness of key people not to intervene. Anne understood that removing Camilla's final role would mean nothing if the decision could be reversed days later. So the decree was built not merely to make a statement, but to close every quiet door through which the old arrangement might return. Charles now carried the weight of that final choice. Anne could force the issue forward, but she could not erase a royal function through personal anger alone. The household authority, the internal structure that formally manages royal duties, staff, and responsibilities, still required the change to be recognized, and the king's acceptance was essential. Without that, the entire move could collapse into another temporary compromise. Senior private secretaries began preparing the final wording with extreme care. They reassigned the practical duties attached to Camilla's position, so there would be no gap in responsibility once the role disappeared. That mattered because a sudden removal without a replacement structure would have created confusion among staff, ceremonial planners, and offices already struggling with competing instructions. Anne wanted no vacuum. She wanted finality. Charles studied the draft alone. He knew approving the structure would wound Camilla deeply, but blocking it could reopen the same conflict that had already damaged trust inside the household. The monarch understood the cruel balance immediately. Protecting his wife might preserve peace at home, while prolonging chaos inside the institution he was responsible for protecting. Anne met her brother one last time before the process moved forward. She told him she would accept whatever decision he made, but she would not continue working under divided instructions. There was no threat in her voice. That made the warning more serious. She was telling him that the old arrangement had become impossible for her to defend. Charles reached the final page and paused over the point where an objection could stop everything. The restructuring instrument, the formal document used to reorganize duties and authority, did not require him to sign a dramatic order against his wife. He only had to refuse to block it. He closed the folder. "Proceed," he told his secretary. The final wording went further than Camilla expected. It removed the role itself, her authority to nominate representatives, and the staff structure attached to the position. Nothing remained that could quietly rebuild the old arrangement later. Charles stayed seated after the secretary left. His hand rested on the closed file, and for several moments he did not move. He had not publicly condemned his wife. He had done something far quieter. He had allowed the door to close. By the time Camilla understood that Charles had chosen not to stop the decree, losing the role was no longer the deepest wound. The deeper blow was realizing she had lost the protection she expected from him. The palace did not erupt after the decree. It became quieter. That silence was worse. Phones stopped ringing through one office. A scheduled briefing disappeared from a diary. Staff who had answered to Camilla were suddenly receiving instructions elsewhere. For the first time, she could see the decision not as words on a page, but as an empty space forming around her. And the realization left her more shaken than the confrontation itself. Camilla entered the office attached to her former role and immediately noticed what had changed. 2 document trays were gone from the desk, along with the briefing papers that normally waited for her approval. The reassignment structure, the new internal arrangement directing duties, staff, and requests to different royal offices, was already active. Within hours, meetings linked to her abolished position had been cancelled, and future requests were being routed elsewhere. This was no symbolic demotion. The machinery had moved on without her. Camilla ran her fingers across the empty space where the trays had been and quietly asked who had authorized the change. The answer hurt more than she expected. The instructions had been prepared before she even received the decree. That meant the palace had not been waiting to see how she reacted. It had expected the removal to stand. The ending had been organized before she was allowed to understand that it was final. Camilla asked to speak with Charles. She was told he was unavailable. The message was ordinary, but in that moment, it felt brutal. She had already lost the role, the staff, and the authority attached to it. Now she was being left alone with the humiliation. When another update arrived confirming that a ceremonial engagement she believed would remain hers had been reassigned to Anne, the private decision suddenly carried the threat of becoming publicly visible. Charles finally sat opposite her later that day. He looked exhausted before either of them spoke. Camilla asked why he had not stopped Anne, and the king struggled for an answer that would not deepen the wound. He could not tell his wife that he believed the conflict had become impossible to sustain, without also admitting that he had chosen the institution over protecting her position. Camilla did not raise her voice. That made the moment harder. She told him losing the role was painful, but losing his intervention hurt more. Charles lowered his eyes and said nothing for several seconds, because there was no answer that could undo what had already happened. Anne learned about those words the following evening. The victory she had fought for suddenly felt heavier. She had restored the chain of command, but she was beginning to wonder whether the price had fallen hardest on her brother. That sentence now pulled the conflict somewhere deeper, toward a private encounter where titles, procedure, and palace strategy would no longer offer anyone protection. After days of decrees, files, and controlled palace language, the turning point arrives without any official present. Charles and Anne meet alone. No secretaries, no advisors, no one to translate emotion into protocol. For the first time since the crisis began, the argument is not about Camilla's role. It is about what duty has demanded from a brother and sister who have spent their lives placing the crown before themselves. Charles had asked for the meeting after hearing how deeply Camilla had been hurt by his refusal to intervene. The crown, the institution of monarchy, and the duties carried in the sovereign's name, had demanded one kind of decision, while marriage demanded something far more personal. Anne arrived expecting her brother to reopen the decree or ask for a compromise. Instead, she found him tired, quiet, and searching for understanding rather than another fight. Charles admitted that he knew why the change had become necessary. The king had seen the divided instructions, the strained staff, and the Windsor confrontation that turned disagreement into open conflict. But necessity, he told Anne, did not make the consequences easier to carry. Camilla had not only lost a role, she had felt abandoned by the person she expected to protect her when the palace turned against her position. Anne listened without interrupting. She told him she had never wanted humiliation, and she had never wanted the decision framed as a punishment. What she wanted was a single chain of responsibility, before competing instructions damaged the household further. The Princess Royal understood that success had come with suffering, but she still believed allowing the old arrangement to continue would have created an even deeper fracture. Charles moved toward the window and stayed there for several seconds. Then he gave his sister the answer she had not expected. "I won't undo it." Anne closed her eyes briefly. The words brought relief, but no sense of victory. Charles explained that he had already instructed his staff to treat the restructuring as settled. There would be no quiet restoration, no later reversal, and no attempt to rebuild Camilla's former authority under another name. The decision was final. Anne offered something in return. She would speak directly with Camilla, not to restore the role, but to make certain the ending was handled with dignity. She did not want headlines turning the decree into a triumph over her brother's wife, and Charles understood that this was the closest thing to peace the situation could still offer. Anne left the room carrying two emotions at once: relief that the institutional battle was over, and sadness at the damage it had left behind. The family had reached its private settlement, but by morning, privacy would disappear. The royal family may have settled the conflict behind closed doors, but the silence around the decree was about to break, and the country would finally see the consequences for itself. The palace had tried to make the transition quiet, but royal power becomes impossible to hide when people can see who is standing where. The decisive public moment came during a ceremonial engagement that Camilla had once expected to attend in her former capacity. Instead, Anne stepped forward alone. One photograph was enough. By midday, the silent decree was no longer an internal royal matter. It was the only story anyone wanted explained. Palace communications moved quickly but carefully. A short statement confirmed that responsibilities connected to Camilla's former role had been permanently reassigned, without turning the announcement into a public rebuke. The ceremonial engagement, an official royal appearance tied to formal duties and public representation, mattered because it gave people something documents could not: visible proof of who now held the responsibility. Commentators immediately linked the change to Anne's growing influence and the earlier struggle over ceremonial authority. Camilla watched the coverage from a private room. She remained still as presenters debated whether the queen consort's independent influence inside the palace had effectively ended. The words kept circling back to the same image of Anne taking the place she had once expected to occupy. Finally, she reached for the remote and switched off the television. The silence afterward felt heavier than the broadcast itself. Anne reacted differently, but she was no more comfortable with the spectacle. She told an aide that the decision had been about function, not punishment, and she disliked the triumphant language spreading across television panels and newspaper columns. The Princess Royal had fought to end divided authority, not to create a public humiliation. Yet that distinction was becoming harder to control once the story escaped palace walls. One newspaper captured the mood with brutal simplicity. Its front page carried a large photograph of Anne entering the engagement beneath the headline, "The Final Handover." She found the paper on the breakfast table the next morning, studied the image for several seconds, then folded it inward until the headline disappeared. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates as broadcasters replayed the same photograph again and again. The scene said more than any formal statement. Anne was present. Camilla was absent. The transfer was no longer hidden behind palace language. Camilla received a message from Charles later that day asking her to join him privately. She read it twice before setting the phone down. The public battle had already been decided, but the emotional verdict still belonged to the family. When the cameras moved on and the newspapers were folded away, only one question remained inside the household. What would they choose to remember? The humiliation, the victory, or the lesson that had brought them here? In the end, there was no reversal, no secret restoration, no last-minute compromise designed to pretend the confrontation had never happened. Anne's decree stood exactly as written. Camilla's final independent royal role was gone. Charles accepted the new structure, and the palace moved forward under a clearer chain of responsibility. Yet the true meaning of the moment was not simply that one woman lost power and another gained it. Camilla understood that before anyone needed to explain it to her. The internal redistribution, the permanent transfer of duties, staff, and authority from one royal office to another, had now been confirmed as settled, closing every practical route for her former position to return. She met Charles privately and asked him one final time whether anything would change. The king told her no. The answer hurt, but it also ended the uncertainty that had made the previous days unbearable. Camilla did not argue. Her anger had burned itself down into something quieter. She told him that losing the role would not define everything that remained of her life beside him, but she needed him to understand what his silence had cost. Charles acknowledged that his refusal to intervene had wounded her. He also made clear that protecting their marriage now required separating personal loyalty from the authority demanded by the crown. They could remain husband and wife without reopening the palace conflict. Anne moved forward without celebration. She assumed the necessary responsibilities and refused to treat the transfer as a personal victory. The Princess Royal had won the institutional argument, but she understood that every clear decision leaves someone carrying the pain. Her purpose had been order, not humiliation, and she knew the final step could not be completed through paperwork alone. Anne later met Camilla privately. She offered no apology for forcing the decree through, because she still believed divided authority had become impossible. But she told her directly that removing the role had never meant erasing her place beside Charles. The Queen Consort listened in silence. Then Anne extended her hand. Camilla hesitated. Then she took it. Neither woman smiled, but neither pulled away. That single gesture did what the decree could not. It ended the personal battle. The silent decree had done exactly what Anne intended. It ended ambiguity. Camilla walked away diminished in power, but not erased. Charles accepted the painful boundary between husband and sovereign. Anne carried the burden of making the decision nobody else wanted to make. The monarchy emerged more disciplined, but every person involved paid an emotional price for that clarity. The role was gone. The struggle was over. The monarchy had chosen order, whatever the personal cost. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.